This is a work of fiction, inspired by historical accounts, and does not promote or glorify illegal activities. The ticking began on the third night after I arrived at Ravenwood Manor, a subtle, almost imperceptible sound that soon became impossible to ignore. I could hear it even when there was no clock around, a persistent echo that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, like the heartbeat of an unseen entity. My name is Ezekiel Morgan, and I am, or rather was, a watchmaker of some repute in Boston. For 25 years, I have devoted my life to the maintenance and restoration of antiques, developing an ear so refined that I could diagnose the trouble of a mechanism merely by the sound of its working. This skill, which had brought me professional recognition and financial comfort, has now become my curse. I had come to Ravenwood after receiving a mysterious letter accompanied by a considerable payment. The sender, a Mr. Thornfield, requested my services in repairing what he described as a unique clock whose importance transcends the mere recording of time. The sum offered was too tempting to refuse, and I confess that my curiosity was immediately piqued by the enigmatic description. The estate sat secluded on the Massachusetts coast, surrounded by gnarled pines and a persistent fog bank that never seemed to lift. The main house was an imposing Victorian structure with asymmetrical turrets and narrow windows that seemed to eye my approach suspiciously. As my carriage wound its way up the winding driveway to the main entrance, I couldn't help but notice how the fog seemed to thicken, swallowing the last of the afternoon sunlight. I was greeted by an elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Pierce, whose pale face wore an expression of perpetual anxiety. Her reaction to my name was disturbing, a barely perceptible tremor of her lips, a glint of apprehension in her grey eyes that she quickly tried to disguise with a forced smile. "Mr. Thornfield has been eagerly awaiting your arrival," she said, leading me through an entrance hall where the air felt thick and still, as if the house had not breathed in years. "Unfortunately, he has been called away on urgent business in Providence. He has left explicit instructions that you be installed in the East Room and begin your work immediately." "And where is the clock I must repair?" I asked, looking at the walls covered with faded wallpaper, where patches of damp formed patterns that for an instant seemed to move like living shadows. "In the North Tower," she replied, avoiding my gaze. "You will have access in the morning. For today, I suggest you rest from your journey. The paths to Ravenwood are not easy, and night brings with it the thickest fog." The room assigned to me was spacious but oppressive. A dark green velvet canopy covered the bed, so heavy that it seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. The window looked out onto the sea, but all that could be seen was the mist, which now moved in slow swirls, as if it had a consciousness of its own. Exhausted from the journey, I fell asleep quickly, but my sleep was disturbed by strange dreams. Spectral figures moving in concentric circles, the distant sound of gears turning, and always, a constant ticking that seemed synchronized with my heartbeat. The next morning, Mrs. Pierce led me to the North Tower after a silent breakfast. The spiral staircase leading to the top was narrow and steep, constructed of dark wood that groaned beneath our footsteps as if in pain. The walls of the staircase were adorned with portraits of people I assumed were Thornfield ancestors, pale faces with intense eyes that seemed to follow our progress. At the top of the tower was a single door, locked with 3 different locks. Mrs. Pierce fumbled with her ring of keys with trembling fingers, muttering something I couldn't make out. When she finally opened the door, she stepped back quickly, as if afraid of what might emerge from the room. "Mr. Thornfield says you must work alone," she explained. "I will leave a tray of luncheon at the foot of the stairs at noon. Please do not linger in this room any longer than necessary." With this enigmatic warning, She hurried downstairs, leaving me alone before the room that contained the mysterious clock. The circular room was surprisingly large, with tall windows on 3 sides that should have provided a panoramic view of the property and the ocean beyond. However, fog pressed against the glass like a living entity, completely obscuring the view outside. The room was filled with ancient astronomical instruments, brass telescopes, astrolabes, celestial globes, all covered in a fine layer of dust, except for a clear path that led to the center of the room. And there was the clock. It wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of a piece of furniture or a wall-mounted instrument, I saw an extraordinary construction that occupied the exact center of the circular room. It was a complex structure made of blackened metal, not bronze or brass, but a material I'd never seen before, with a dull sheen that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The central mechanism was enclosed in a thick glass dome, revealing gears and pendulums that moved in patterns that defied all mechanical logic I'd ever known. The gears moved not in circles, but in impossible spirals and elliptical shapes. Some seemed to spin in contradictory directions simultaneously, while others pulsed as if breathing. The main pendulum swung not in a predictable arc, but in chaotic patterns that nevertheless maintained some kind of hypnotic rhythm. Even more disturbing was the dial. Instead of the usual Roman or Arabic numerals, it displayed symbols that were completely unfamiliar to me. Not hieroglyphs or runes, but shapes that seemed to change subtly when viewed directly. And there were not 2 but 5 hands of varying lengths, moving at different speeds, sometimes overlapping perfectly for an instant before diverging again. I approached with professional caution and yet irresistible fascination. The sound of the mechanism was equally disconcerting. Not the familiar steady ticking, but a complex symphony of clicks, hums, and occasional metallic sighs that resembled labored breathing. If this story is sending chills down your spine, be sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with what you think will happen next. Your interaction helps us bring you more dark tales like this, straight from the depths of the unknown. On a table next to the clock, I found a dark, leather-bound diary. On the first page, in a precise but shaky handwriting, I read, "Record of cycles observed by Alistair Thornfield, 1887-1923. Leafing through the yellowed pages, I discovered meticulous notes on the movements of the clock's hands, correlated with astronomical observations, tides, and most disturbingly, incidents in the fog, as the author called them. The initial entries were scientific and objective, but gradually they became more frantic and obsessive. One particularly disturbing passage caught my attention. October 3rd, 1912. The third hand completed its revolution tonight, coinciding with the predicted planetary alignment. The fog thickened as never before, pressing against the windows with such force that I feared for the glass. I heard voices in the white density, not intelligible words, but a sort of rhythmic chanting that seemed synchronized with the movement of the pendulum. Eleanor saw something moving outside. She insists it was only a fisherman lost in the fog, but her eyes tell a different story. Something is trying to get in. I closed the diary, suddenly aware of the silence that had descended upon the room. The clock had stopped. All the hands were motionless, pointing to different symbols on the enigmatic dial. I approached to examine the mechanism through the glass of the dome, and it was then that I noticed something extraordinary. There was no visible key or opening for winding the clock. In fact, I could see no conventional means of accessing the inner workings. I spent the entire afternoon examining the exterior of the clock, looking for some way into the mechanism. I found only a small metal plate at the base, engraved with symbols similar to those on the dial, and a single hole the size of a small coin. There was no key in sight, and nothing in the documents left behind mentioned how to open the case. As the sun began to set, I noticed it only by the gradual diminishing of the diffuse light that filtered through the mist. I decided to return to my room to reflect on the situation. As I descended the spiral staircase, I noticed that the tray of lunch that Mrs. Pierce had promised was still untouched on the bottom step. The food was cold, and a thin film like cobwebs had formed over the liquid in the teacup. During dinner, served in an immense dining room where only one place was set at the end of a table that could seat 20, I tried to question Mrs. Pierce about the clock and its owner. "Did Mr. Thornfield inherit the watch?" I asked casually, watching his reaction. The spoon she held clinked against the tray. "No, sir. He brought it back from one of his expeditions to the East many years ago, before the tragedies." "Tragedies?" She glanced nervously at the windows, where fog pressed against the glass like pale fingers trying to find a way. "In Mr. Thornfield's wife, Mrs. Eleanor, and then their son, young Edward, both of them lost in the mist. They went out on nights when the clock stopped and never returned, at least not completely." Before I could question her about this last enigmatic comment, she hurriedly withdrew, leaving me alone with my troubled thoughts and the increasingly audible ticking sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the mansion. That night, fog invaded my dreams. I walked down an endless hallway where clocks of every description adorned the walls: grandfather clocks, pocket watches, sundials of impossible designs. They all showed different times, creating a cacophony of unsynchronized ticking. At the end of the hallway, a door opened onto a pulsating white void. A figure emerged from that whiteness, a human silhouette that moved erratically, as if each part of its body were in a different time. It came closer, and I saw that it was a woman in Victorian dress, her face young but her eyes ancient, infinitely ancient. "You have come to fix what cannot be fixed," she said, her voice resonating as if speaking from a great distance. "The clock does not keep time. It keeps it away. As long as the pendulum swings, they cannot cross completely." I woke with a start, drenched in a cold sweat. The room was freezing, and the fog had found its way in, forming sinuous patterns on the wooden floor. And the ticking, that non-existent ticking, was louder, as if the invisible clock were now right next to me, inside the room itself. Unable to go back to sleep, I lit a candle and continued reading Thornfield's diary. The subsequent entries became increasingly disturbing. February 14th, 1921. Edward disappeared today. The clock stopped exactly at 3:17 in the afternoon, and all the hands aligned for a fleeting moment. Mist entered the house as never before, creeping under doors and through windows even when they were closed. I found the back door open, with small footprints leading out, straight into the whiteness. I followed them as far as I could, calling for him until my voice failed me. In the twilight I heard his laughter in the distance, but mingled with other voices, voices that belonged to no human throat. When I returned to the tower, the clock had resumed its movement, but something had changed in its rhythm. Now it seemed to count down to something inevitable. On the next page, the handwriting became almost illegible. The words squeezed and overlapped, as if written in a state of extreme agitation. "They are in the clock, or the clock is in them. The mist is their breath, their body, their substance. Time works differently for them. Not linear, but cyclical, spiral. Each time the clock stops, the veil between our worlds thins. They took Eleanor and Edward, but not completely. Their essences are still trapped between here and there. I can hear them calling in the nights when the fifth hand touches the symbol that resembles a broken hourglass. I have figured out how to bring them back, but the price is too high. Or maybe not. What value is my own existence compared to theirs? The entries ended abruptly after this passage. The remaining pages were blank, except for the last, which contained a single drawing, a detailed representation of the clock face, with a specific marking circled and a note: portal when all align. Sacrifice when last hand crosses vortex. The next morning I returned to the tower with renewed determination and growing apprehension. The clock had resumed its movement during the night, the impossible gears turning smoothly, the pendulum swinging. In its chaotic but deliberate pattern, after hours of meticulous observation, I began to detect a pattern underlying the mechanism's seemingly random movements. The 5 hands were gradually converging into a specific configuration, the same one illustrated on the last page of the diary. It was then that I noticed something that had escaped my initial attention. Attached to the bottom of the clock, partially hidden beneath the base, was a small carved wooden case. Inside I found a key, not an ordinary clock key, but an intricate object made of the same strange metal as the main structure. Its shape was bizarre, with asymmetrical projections and angles that seemed to change subtly depending on how the light fell upon it. Comparing it to the hole I had discovered earlier in the clock's base, there was no doubt it was the key to the mechanism, but something kept me from using it right away. The veiled warnings in the diary, the disappearance of Thornfield's family, the thickening fog that now completely obscured the tower windows. Everything indicated that winding the clock might have consequences beyond my comprehension. I decided to seek out Mrs. Pierce for more information before proceeding. I descended the spiral stairs, calling out to her, but the house seemed strangely empty and silent. In the kitchen, I found evidence of an interrupted meal: a bread knife on a cutting, board, partially kneaded dough, a still warm oven. It was as if she had abandoned her duties in a hurry. I walked through the dark corridors, calling out to her, but only the echo of my own voice answered me, reverberating through the empty rooms like a phantom sound. At some point, I realized that I had lost my way in the complex layout of the mansion. I found myself in a wing I had not visited before, with corridors that seemed to bend in on themselves at impossible angles. And then I heard, distantly but unmistakably, a child's voice humming a melody that was all too familiar. I followed the sound to a half-open door that led into what appeared to be a child's room, preserved in time. Antique toys were neatly arranged on the shelves, a rocking horse sat motionless in the center of the room, and a small bed with perfectly straight sheets. Sitting on the edge of the bed was a small figure with his back to me. A child, apparently a boy of about 8, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. "Hello?" I called hesitantly. "You must be Edward?" The figure slowly turned, and I involuntarily recoiled. The boy's face was partially translucent, as if made of condensed mist. Through his features I could see the wall behind him, and his eyes. His eyes were grey swirls with no pupils or irises. "Have you come to wind the clock?" he asked, his voice sounding simultaneously near and far, like an echo before the original sound. "Daddy said someone would come. They're waiting. Mommy and I are waiting too, on the other side. This story is reaching its darkest climax yet. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the perfect time. Hit the subscribe button and leave your theory in the comments about what's really on the other side of the fog. Your participation fuels our work of bringing you the most disturbing stories of the unknown." Before I could respond, the boy's figure dissolved into wisps of mist that drifted toward the hallway. I instinctively followed him, only to find myself inexplicably back at the base of the North Tower's stairs. It was already night, though I hadn't noticed the passage of time. The mansion was silent, except for the ever-present ticking that now seemed to resonate throughout the entire structure. The fog had completely invaded the interior, reducing visibility to a few feet and giving every object an ethereal quality, as if reality itself were dissolving. I climbed the spiral staircase, again driven by a compulsion I could not explain. The door to the clock room was wide open, though I was sure I had closed it behind me. The air inside the circular room was chilly, so cold that my breath formed thick clouds in front of my face. The clock had stopped again. All 5 hands were almost aligned, pointing to symbols that formed a pattern that exactly matched the drawing. On the last page of the diary, only the last hand, the thinnest and longest, was still a few degrees away from its final position. Mist swirled around the clock in a spiral pattern, like water draining down an invisible drain. And within the mist, I could make out shapes, human silhouettes that moved languidly, like underwater dancers. I recognized the boy I had seen in the nursery, and beside him was the figure of a woman in Victorian dress, the same one from my dream. But there were other shapes in the mist, less human, elongated appendages, impossible geometric structures that folded into dimensions my eyes couldn't fully process. And eyes, dozens of floating eyes that blinked in unison with the absent motion of the now still pendulum. I approached the clock, the strange key weighing in my pocket like a stone. I knew instinctively that I had a choice to make: wind the clock, restarting its protective movement, or allow the last hand to reach its final position, fully opening what Thornfield had called the portal. The mist thickened around me, and whispering voices emerged from its substance. Pleas, promises, warnings, all blended into a cacophony that threatened my sanity. "Bring us back," I heard the woman's voice. Eleanor, presumably. "Edward and I are trapped between worlds. Only a sacrifice can restore the balance." "Don't wind it," countered another voice, which I recognized as Mrs. Pierce's, though I couldn't see it in the fog. "Mr. Thornfield tried to bring them back, and now he's trapped too. The clock keeps the portal closed enough that they can't cross completely. If it stops permanently—" Her voice was abruptly silenced, as if something had dragged her away. The mist now pulsed with an inner light, and the cold intensified to the point where my fingers felt numb. The last hand moved almost imperceptibly, now only an instant away from completing the alignment. With trembling fingers, I pulled the key from my pocket. Its metal was inexplicably hot, almost burning my frozen skin. The shapes in the mist moved closer, anxious, expectant. It was then that I understood the true nature of the clock and the purpose of my summons. It was not an instrument to measure time, but to contain something that existed beyond it. And Thornfield had not called me to fix it. He wanted me to make his impossible decision. The last hand trembled, seconds away from its final position. The mist condensed further, forming a vortex centered on the clock. Through it, I glimpsed momentarily another reality, a place of absurd geometry where colossal structures floated in a luminescent void and impossible beings moved in precise, mathematical patterns. With one decisive movement, I inserted the key into the hole in the base of the clock. It was time to make my choice. What happened next remains fragmented in my memory, like shards of a broken mirror reflecting different versions of reality. I remember turning the key, feeling an initial resistance, followed by a deep click that seemed to reverberate beyond the room, beyond the mansion, perhaps beyond the world itself. The clock made a sound no human mechanism could produce, a high-pitched whine that grew in complexity until it became a symphony of gears and strained metal. The hands spun rapidly in opposite directions. The gears, visible through the glass dome, reconfigured themselves into increasingly complex patterns, and the pendulum swung so violently that I feared the entire structure might shatter. The mist reacted like a living entity being wounded. It jerked back from the clock, the shapes within it writhing in silent agony. The figures I believed to be Eleanor and Edward Thornfield reached out toward me, their hazy faces expressing inhuman despair before they were torn away by the maelstrom. For a fleeting moment, something seemed to be being pulled across an invisible threshold, huge, geometrically impossible shapes trying to force their way into our world. The entire room shook. The glass in the windows cracked in fractal patterns, and I felt as if reality itself were being stretched to the point of breaking. Then, with a deafening crash, the clock resumed its normal rhythm, that complex symphony of clicks and whirs that I had noticed on my first inspection. The mist retreated to the edges of the room, still visible but contained like a chained beast. I staggered back, exhausted beyond comprehension. My hand that had turned the key was marked, not burned or bruised in the conventional sense, but altered. The skin now bore a subtle pattern that resembled the symbols on a watch face, visible only when the light was hit at a certain angle. By dawn, the fog had cleared, revealing for the first time the view from the tower windows, the grey, choppy ocean, the rocky cliffs, and the Ravenwood estate in all its decaying grandeur. Of Mrs. Pierce there was no sign, and instinctively he knew he would never see her again. On the table where Thornfield's diary had been, I now found a letter addressed to me, written in a handwriting I did not recognize. Mr. Morgan, if you are reading this, then you have made your choice. The clock will continue its work for another cycle, keeping the portal closed enough to protect our world, but never completely closed. This is the balance that must be maintained. They allowed me to leave this message as part of our agreement. Eleanor, Edward, and I now exist in the interstice, neither completely there nor completely here. This is the price we paid, and the price you will eventually pay as well. The mark on your hand is more than a symbol, it is a link. The watch is now synchronized not only with the stars and dimensions beyond, but with your own life force. As long as you live, it will continue to tick. Do not attempt to leave Ravenwood. The mist would find you, no matter where you hid. Your life now belongs to the clock, just as mine did before you. In exactly 34 years, 7 months, and 13 days, the clock will stop again. When it does, you must find your successor as I found you, with sincere regret and gratitude, Alistair Thornfield. That was 7 years ago. I remain in Ravenwood as a reluctant guardian of the clock and the portal it keeps partially closed. I have learned to read its complex rhythms, to anticipate the moments when the fog will thicken and the voices will grow louder in the walls. Sometimes, on the rare clear days when the fog has completely receded, I think about running away. But the mark on my hand throbs painfully at the slightest thought of escape, and I know that the watch and I are inexorably connected. The ticking I hear constantly is not just that of the mechanism in the North Tower, it is the countdown of my own existence measuring the time until I too become part of the mist, and another unfortunate is called to take my place. If you are reading this, consider it a warning. If you ever receive a generous offer to repair a unique clock in a secluded mansion surrounded by fog, refuse. For some mechanisms were never meant to be understood by human minds, and some portals were meant to remain forever closed. Ezekiel Morgan, Ravenwood Mansion, November 5th, 1889.